Dr. Molly Gilmartin is an investment manager at AlbionVC, who manage over $1 billion in assets and have invested in companies like Arecor, Healios and Pando. She studied medicine at Oxford, was a founding team member of Pando, chief commercial officer of Induction healthcare, a consultant at McKinsey, and is now an investor at AlbionVC. We talk a lot about the psychology of communication. We talk about strength-based feedback and radical candour, about how being inquisitive can get you very far, how energy is Molly's superpower, and lots of other interesting frameworks that Molly finds useful in her career. We finish off by discussing a thesis on the emerging B to C to B model in healthcare. This is a really value-packed episode. I hope you enjoy. Molly, you've done a lot of different things in terms of academics, medicine, charity, consulting, investment, startups. And throughout those, if you had to rank or you had to pick the ones where you felt like you had the potential to make the most impact, and the ones where you felt that you weren't making much of an impact. And by impact, I mean an impact on the world and probably a positive impact. Because I mean, some of those, like say consulting in healthcare has a pretty, I think, negative reputation amongst clinical staff, at least, and people in the NHS. So where do you set all of that?
I think impact's really interesting because I remember like being a medical student saying I was really motivated by personal impact and positive impact. So having a role in that positive impact. But it even then felt very binary. Like this is either impactful or it's not impactful. And for me, like purpose is really important. And if impact is a big aspect of your purpose, which I think for a lot of clinicians, that is the case, it's about really finding what is the type of impact that really motivates you. And what's really interesting, if you look at those different situations, they're all in a binary sense, you could say impactful. But it's like, what role do you play in it? And the thing that's really interesting is whilst consulting can have that reputation, and I can see why whenever I was a medical student and you saw, firms come in where people didn't understand how you work and the workflow, it's exactly the same for technology. If you try and implement something where you don't understand the day-to-day workflow, it's not going to be impactful because it's not going to be lasting. So whether it's trying to implement a new technology or a new way of working, like a consulting project where you're trying to say, change how outpatient appointments work. It's about really understanding what is the workflow day to day of the people doing that job. And if you want what you're trying to do to be impactful, you need to work within that. And often the challenge is like, if you look at sort of other sectors, you've got Uber, you've got delivery, they've completely disrupted the way those industries work. In healthcare, disruption has to happen, first of all, by integrating into the workflow. You can't just go and switch it all up. And that, I think in both, whether it's startup technologies in the NHS or consulting, that's the bit that sometimes I think gets missed when people haven't been from a clinical background, is you don't get that. And I think it's really tough, therefore, to rank them because actually, like in the moment, I genuinely felt in those health tech startups that I could completely change the game of healthcare. Now, did it? It depends on which hospital. I mean, some hospitals now do use Pando across the hospital and others use Induction for all their appointment booking systems. And yeah, it's impactful. But for me, like that's why I'm in VC now, is I do think those health tech startups have a way of building a diverse team where you've got the clinical input, you've got the techies, you've got the people that are much more strategic. And together you can really, if you do it right, bottom up, really change how healthcare is delivered or research is conducted. So that's why I'm in VC, is I believe that if I can find the founders that want to do that and work with those entrepreneurs and founding teams, then we can really change how healthcare works.
I've been reading a lot about talent and intelligence and things like that. And there's a really good book by Tyler Cohen and Daniel Gross on the topic. And one misconception I had is that, and I think a lot of people have, is that you're either like a really good surgeon, and if that surgeon went into industry, they might not be good in that role. Or you're a really good business person, and if you went into policy, you'd struggle in that role. And from what I've been reading, at least, it seems like that's not really a thing. People are usually generally, or talented people at least, like the kinds of people who after a few months, they'd be good in any role really. And you really strike me as that kind of person who's had experience everywhere and kind of excelled in lots of different places. So the question I wanted to ask you was, when you've been changing roles and entering completely new industries, are there kind of general principles that you've brought that you think have helped you excel in those roles? And similarly, are there things that you've found surprisingly difficult entering certain roles? For example, jumping from medicine to industry or startup land? Like, how's that been?
I think that's such an interesting point because it's sort of like labels. And that's happened to me in my career, even though it's only been short. I mean, Whenever I told some of the people in McKinsey that I was going to go into VC, people were like, but you're not an investor, you're an operator, because you've been in startups before McKinsey. Whereas a lot of people go to McKinsey straight out of like clinical practice, and then they decide whether they're going to go into startup world or investing or something else down the line, or stay at McKinsey. And I find that fascinating. It's like people do want to label people. I remember listening to a talk by this psychologist, she's called Megan Wrights, around, leadership psychology. And the reason we label people as humans is that it makes it much easier. Like if we had to work everybody out bottom up, it would be impossible. So what we're doing is we're taking facts we learn about people and then labeling them to speed up our processing power. And that links to diversity too, right? Because we're making those unconscious biases all the time. And so I like to think when people come to me and say, how have you picked what you've done and how have you moved between things? I always encourage people to think about their competencies. One, so like what things are you good at? Like, are you good at energizing a room, or are you good at like taking a really difficult problem and thinking about the data points and finding a structured approach to solving that puzzle? Or, on the completely other side, do you like working solo or do you like working in a team? So it's like, what are your competencies? And then what are the things that give you flow or make you really happy where it doesn't even feel like work? Because I think that's the beauty that I've had a lot in my time is, and I was talking to my parents about it a couple of weeks ago, is like, I haven't really felt like I've had hard jobs before because I've just been working on really fun projects. And I think that's like the dream. But I think, humility is really important when you move roles and when you move into new things. There's always more to learn, no matter how senior you are. And people love sharing their insights as well. I'm sure you know that, asking people lots of questions. So I think when you're moving roles, like being hungry and curious to learn more about that space and the problems that are being solved in that, and think about things in more of like a problem solving mindset rather than a static mindset, really helps. And something I've found that has always been like, now I sort of see it as my superpower is like energy. I'm a super enthusiastic person, but also learning how to manage that, right? Because going into a room and just being like the high energy person isn't always the best thing to do. It's almost like an orchestra, like when are you going to play your drums versus your like solo violin? And so understanding your strengths and weaknesses, because most people's strengths can become weaknesses if they're overdone. So learning what those core sort of superpowers are for you, and then learning how to use them in different environments is super important. The other thing is asking for advice. There are lots of people that have taken steps and new decisions and new career paths. And you can speed up and accelerate your learning if you ask them for their insight and advice. The beauty of advice is you can take it. You don't have to then act on it. You can assimilate which bits you want to use. And also it comes back to that feedback point. We all get a bit scared of feedback, and I'm not really sure. I think it's just human nature, isn't it? You're worried someone's going to tell you haven't done something well. But actually, it'd be much better to know that week 2 of a new role than a year in, when you had a whole year that you could have changed it. So I think when you're taking on new opportunities, if you go to people that are a bit more senior and been there a bit longer than you and say, could you give me some feedback about what things that you think I've done well and how I could do other things better, that gives you lots of room to make improvements. I'm a massive fan of strengths-based feedback. So you're doing this really well, you could do more of it. When you did this thing, if you did this bit of it more, it would make it better rather than kind of always focusing on the negative. So I'm a massive fan of feedback, and I think if you can keep that front and center, it really helps development.
Have you read that article by the Harvard Business Review called The Feedback Fallacy? It's a bit niche.
But I should. Sounds interesting.
It basically reflects exactly what you've said, that we think of knowledge as something that's like a vessel. So, it's like a glass. To improve someone, you take away bad points and you add good points, but it's more like growing a tree. So you're trying to bud the branches off. And what they make the point of is that anytime you give negative feedback, it usually doesn't really help someone. And it's more about kind of nurturing and giving positive feedback and growing the areas where they're already doing well, rather than kind of criticizing someone.
That's exactly what I mean. Even if you take situations that haven't gone so well, there'll be bits that did go well in that. And it's trying to give, really, the key thing with feedback is being really specific and example driven. So if you make generalized comments, at times you are not as enthusiastic as you could be about new people's ideas or something. It's like, how do you actually be more specific? Like in this meeting, when this person raised an idea, you weren't demonstrating to them how excited you can be about other ideas. And when you're excited about people's ideas, it really makes people quite inspired. So the more that you can bring that energy when people are raising new points and new thoughts, the more it will make our work more successful. It's like those sorts of of points really are very different than honing in on something that hasn't gone well.
One of the things I noted when I was looking through your career and LinkedIn and things was that you've made a lot of jumps and done a lot of things, but also for quite like a short time. So maybe some things less than 2 years. And I wanted to ask, is that something that just was part and parcel of like a rapid ascent and just rapidly progressing? Is that something that you've kind of thought about? Was it something that you were having itchy feet when you entered different roles? Like, what was the reason for you maybe, not committing, say, 5 or 10 years to one track?
I think what we all are starting to see in careers is that there's less of a focus on staying in one role for a really long time, as long as your reasoning for the next opportunity is right. So again, to the strengths-based feedback point, it's less about what was wrong with the role you're in and more about what was so brilliant and exciting about that role that made you step there. And as long as you're really clear and specific about those points, I don't think it is detrimental to move quickly. At the same point, I don't think I was looking for opportunities at the times that each of those career jumps happened. Someone approached me and said, oh, this company's looking for someone, or this McKinsey are looking at expanding their healthcare technology focus, etc. And then that just gets very exciting and something I want to jump on board with. So I think it's a tricky one, because at the same point, I still would give people advice that you really want to make sure that you've soaked up everything you can get from an opportunity before you move. But if an opportunity is something that you really don't want to miss out on, then I still think you can do that. There's a great saying from someone at McKinsey that was, make sure you get your groceries. And I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it. Every time you're in a role, how do you get all of your groceries from that? And make sure you haven't left without the milk or the fruit that you need or whatever it is. And I think that's a good mindset. It's like, have you really soaked up everything you can from this opportunity? But also realizing that things are you're not closing a door. So you may leave a role, but you could go back there. It's trying to keep that, what is it, loss aversion psychology, is that we always worry more about the stuff we lose than the stuff we can gain. But realizing that actually career paths are much more dynamic now, I think it makes that feel much more exciting and opportunistic.
I want to ask you a little bit about what you learned about communication, and particularly in the context of dealing with clients, dealing with customers, and generally in industry. Are there things you picked up about either communicating difficult ideas well, or communicating bad news, or setting boundaries? Are there any things that come to mind in terms of, through all your experiences, that you've picked up on those kinds of topics?
A lot of the time as humans, we're listening, but we're listening with the intent to respond. So we're constantly thinking about, okay, what am I going to say to this and back to that? And listening is so important, because with listening plus empathy, you get a real understanding of that person. So really understand the root of the problem or their concern or their challenge. And if you really understand the root cause and drivers of that, that is much easier to then problem solve with them. Often we jump in with a solution. We're all in solution mindset. If you don't understand the problem correctly, you won't build the right solution. And so, really at McKinsey, they call that a problem statement. So you really flesh out, what is this problem that we're trying to solve here? And then that sets you up with the structure that you approach for the problem solving. And I think it's exactly the same in communications. So if you understand the person and what their needs are and what their challenges are, then together you do true problem solving that's much more efficient. I think there was a study, wasn't there, in the BMJ around if you let a patient speak for, was it 1 minute, continuously as a GP, then the whole consultation is much shorter, because you can solve. What, do you remember it?
Yeah, I think it was something like not interrupting patients when they make their initial problem statement. Yeah. And was it the average was within 10 seconds they're interrupted?
Yeah, but that's because the GP knows they've got 8 minutes if they're not already running late, and they're thinking, okay, I'm labeling I'm already essentially adding labels to what that patient's sort of stream of comms is. They're going, okay, I can see this pain point. Okay, I think it's this diagnosis. And they're also labeling stuff about that patient. And actually, sometimes if we apply the same thing to humans, yes, a lot of the time we are quite good AI machines. I read this thing once that your gut instinct is your own internal machine learning algorithm, which I loved. But actually what it's sort of saying is you're constantly weighting all of the different data points in your head subconsciously. And sometimes, I guess, if you just give it a little bit longer, you might get more data points that are much heavier weighted, and then your algo will be a bit different. So I think in terms of comms, listening is actually so important. And then empathy is also super important. And that's something I'm finding really interesting about VC, is because I've spent time in hospitals throughout medical school. I've then, been in startup land where I've actually had to try and scale a tech solution. So I really get the pain points of that. And then being in McKinsey, where I've seen much larger organizations and kind of the change management that sits there, it makes you quite empathetic to entrepreneurs that are pitching to you. So you're not expecting, perfect metrics and amazing product market fit, but what you want to do is understand that there's a journey to that. And I think it really helps build strong relationships with founders, which I'm really enjoying.
Molly, I've got a question for you, which is a problem I've been having personally, but I think you made a few points on it that means that you might be able to offer some helpful advice. And it's that you mentioned that, one of the formulas of your achievement and going into different industries and doing quite well is that you enter that with almost like an inquisitive mindset of playing that role of the inquisitive person who's asking for feedback, asking a lot of questions. And the one thing I'm finding now is that I've definitely played that role in a lot of things I've done, but I'm finding that, in some of the different projects I'm doing, I'm having to play the role of someone who's more of a slightly more of an authority. So I can't enter those roles almost being like, the inquisitive student who's just trying to learn, but instead I'm having to project myself as more of an authority figure in those positions. So I guess my question really is that, have you found that you've personally either changed your role throughout your career and you've been doing less of that as you've got more senior? And do you have any kind of thoughts on that problem I'm facing?
I think it's a super interesting one, because I always think that was my secret sauce early in my career, was that I could be the young, enthusiastic woman, Northern Irish. Like, I had pink hair at one point, and I was that sort of enthusiastic puppy. And I think learning that professionalism and actually, as you've just put it, like, while in a role of authority, how do you also keep learning, is a really big challenge. I guess a few thoughts. One is that actually there always are people more senior. So it's working out who are your mentors that will be dynamic. So they don't have to be in the organization you're in, but how do you approach people that can give you that informal or even formal mentorship about some of these challenges? I think secondly is, that humility that we talked about earlier. People actually find it really interesting to see what you're finding difficult. So I think even if you are the leader in that role, if you can be really open and say, look, these are the 3 things that we're stuck on. And that's where structure is really important. People often like clear vision, clear structure, and a clear task list, especially clinicians. We love our lists. And I think, it's okay to have stuff that's unsolved. And sometimes I think, especially whenever as clinicians we step out of medicine, we don't want to show that we might have a bit of a gap around some of our sort of business blocks, knowledge or something like that. Anything like that is really easy to learn. The bit that you can't coach in senior roles is the human management, which actually as clinicians we're pretty good at. And what you will notice if you look at career paths, the more senior you get, it's not that you're getting more technically competent, it's that you're managing more humans and all of the emotions that come with that. So technical stuff can always be learnt. But actually, the human management is what is going to make anyone a successful leader. So I think curiosity and energy will always win the game, but also making sure that you're delivering value on the stuff that you need to do will give you a free pass, then ask those difficult questions. So whenever I was taking on roles that maybe, I wasn't an expert in yet, I always tried to deliver value quickly. And there's always tasks that people need done. So when you're asking for that advice, it's also saying, okay, is there anything I could help you with? Are you writing any articles? Do you need anyone to do some research for you? So you give back as well. And I think that if you can find a way to have that, add that transactional benefit to them as well, it really builds a stronger relationship and it helps cement that network as well, because you're someone they'll remember.
Well, let me ask you a question that I sometimes get in trouble for asking, which is that in leadership or even just in the way you behave as a team, are there ever any points in which you think you need to be a bit of a dick to be a good leader or a good team player? Because I think it's easy to say, never play that character. But have you found any points where you do have to pull that card a bit?
So I'm really direct communicator. So I really do say what I think. And I think earlier in my career, I therefore thought that I could see how if you didn't add the empathy into that, it can be like radical candour as such. If you're too direct, it can really push people's buttons. I actually really don't think that is a helpful way. I think you can be a direct but empathetic. So again, it comes back to that point about understanding what is driving and motivating and concerning or challenging the people that you're working with. And then you can be super direct about the comms in an empathetic, specific, example-backed way. Because actually, what's the benefit to getting someone's back up? Do you think that's persuading them to get on board with your mission or your movement or to work with you on this problem? And even if someone's not performing up to scratch or they're actually being detrimental to progress, if you can be really empathetically specific and direct about how they need to make a change, people can't argue with that. I've seen that a lot in leaders I've had the chance to work with. You have to be able to be direct and not miss and hit the wall whenever there's a challenge that they face. But if you can do that in a way where people can understand why it's important, the purpose of it, and what they need to do to change in a way that hasn't made them feel personally attacked, I think that's super important. Like, we're all humans, we all have our personalities, we all have our strengths and weaknesses. And to the point I made at the beginning, our strengths become weaknesses when they're unhinged. And so helping people learn how to play their orchestra is so important. The other thing, back to that psychologist I mentioned earlier, Megan Wright, it's another thing that she talked about in one of her talks. She did it at the Royal Society of Medicine whenever I listened to it. And she said, do you think you're scary? It's like, we never think we're scary, right? We're approachable, we're nice. Like, do we need to be a bit of a horrible person as a leader? Like, we're scary to someone. Like, when you're in an authority role, you do scare people. It's really weird, but I'm sure the medical student that's been working with you is scared of you. Like, you're the big dog. And I think what you have to realize is that in any authority role, there are going to be people under you that do find you intimidating. And intimidation means they don't ask the good questions. And if they're not asking those questions, then they're not learning, they're not personally developing. So how do we create an atmosphere where people feel that openness? And that then sets you up a brilliant platform for direct communication when things aren't going well.
Look, let me make the other case, though, that if you are someone who's either intimidating or you're like the GP who interrupts the patient within the first 10 seconds, then I guess from their point of view, or if you thought about it, one of the benefits is that it does get shit done. You know what I mean? Like, if you're kind of the empathetic person that's very approachable, like, do you feel like sometimes there is the potential that you can either be walked over or people aren't going to be taking you as seriously? Do you know what I mean?
Okay, but does it get shit done? Like, in the sense of, has that patient taken back the advice the GP's given them when they've interrupted about potentially not the issue that they came in for and actually implement it into their lifestyle? Or if you're the leader directing a team as to your next growth campaign for getting new users for your product, and you've jumped on the person that had an idea and said, we don't have time for that, or you've been direct, like, is that motivating them to give that extra 2 hours that evening to the campaign? Like, ultimately, it is that implementation point of, like, the way to implement anything, whether it's within a business, whether it's in a hospital, whether it's to a patient in a clinical environment, is about persuading people to get on board with your idea and your approach. And if you don't understand where they're sitting and where they're coming from, you're not going to be able to create that strategy correctly. So I think it can feel at the time like stuff's getting done, but really is it? And that's the question I would ask. In my opinion, I think if you can bring people with you, that's how you create a movement and how you really disrupt how something's done, whether it's an individual patient's care or how technology is adopted in a hospital.
Well, yeah, I know you've done a lot of research and put a lot of thought into equity in healthcare leadership. And maybe we can link this into equity and investment as well. If you imagine that, I was an alien and you had to explain some of the challenges that a woman would face in healthcare leadership or becoming a leader, what are they?
Super interesting, because I actually always have said I think I'm super lucky in that I don't feel in my career that being a woman has been a disadvantage. And then I talk to entrepreneurs, I talk to young women, and I realized that maybe I've just sort of overlooked that. My mum worked as a doctor throughout my childhood. She's an oncologist, and my dad has run his own business, a coffee business. And so I think I always felt like I could achieve anything a little bit. I was a complete nerd at school, and I was always doing these little side fundraising projects, etc. But I think part of the reason for why I've always felt quite ambitious is that I have had people that I'm living with that are doing cool stuff. And in my image, that's not gender specific. And what I do find interesting is when I looked into this a lot around applying to medicine. So when I was in medical school, set up a little project called Applican. Don't be an applicant, be an applican. Very cheesy. But what it focused on was helping students get into medical school. And then I teamed up with a charity called Into University, and we set up a scheme called Into Medicine. It's now called Into Healthcare. And it was helping students from disadvantaged backgrounds apply to medical school or apply into healthcare related roles. And when you do the research, it's actually pretty stark. So 77% of children or students, studying medicine, their parents went to university. And so I'm like, that's crazy. Started to look into it, speak to the school students. And actually, most of the school students I talked to at the inter-university centres weren't thinking about being doctors. They were thinking about being other roles in a hospital that potentially they have a parent or a family member doing. So what you start to realise is like, what you think is achievable is what's in your ether. Like I never thought that I'd be a pop star. Like I didn't know any pop stars. It's kind of this thing, right, of like, we think we can do what we see others in our sphere as we grow up doing. So when it comes to medicine, when it comes to leadership, or when it comes to entrepreneurship, how many women do we see? So what you start to realise is this unconscious bias that we say people have when selecting people for things. As individuals, we have unconscious bias about ourselves based on what we see. So how do we create that visibility and that opportunity? And that comes back to that work I did whenever I was at NHS Improvement around leadership. And we interviewed some of the top female leaders in the NHS. And it came up this thing about, it's actually a tap on the shoulder. So how do leaders tap people that are underrepresented, whether it's gender or other causes of diversity and inclusion? How do we actually tap them on the shoulder and say, why don't you do this? Why don't you take this opportunity? Have you thought about doing this? And so one of the areas that I really want to work on is like going back to school children. Would you like to run your own business one day? It's those sorts of questions that we need to be asking and inspire young people of all genders, ethnicities. We need to say, you can do it. But the way to do it is not just like open-ended inspirational quotes. It's actually showing them examples of people that look like them doing it.
There's a really good article by Scott Alexander called The Hero License. And he's an American psychiatrist. And he asks the question of why are there so many great families in history? So, for example, Charles Darwin, his cousin was Francis Galton, who, had some questionable beliefs on different things. But they had this network of family who all went on to achieve great things. Then there's is it Niels Bohr, who himself, I think, was a Nobel Prize winner. And then his brother was also a professor. And then his cousin was an Olympic athlete. So they were just asking the question of, what is it about these families? And the first thing you think of is there must have been some privilege or there must have been some nepotism and passing on. But a lot of these family members had never met and they sometimes lived in different countries and they didn't really have a connection. The other thing you think is genetics, but then he disproves that a little bit as well. And the thing he lands on at the end is the hero license. So just the fact that you know someone in your family who's gone on to achieve something brilliant means that you are the type of person then who also believes that you can do it as well.
Yeah. Well, it's also just you've seen someone do it and you realize that it's not like, you hear about a founder that set up a unicorn company, you think that must have been really hard. No, it is really hard. But it's like because you've sometimes seen people do it day to day, you know what the day-to-day workflows are. And so you're like, oh, actually, I could try that. The other thing is also the point in your career that you take these decisions. So if you look at when I went into startup world, like I had nothing to lose. Like I was a medical student. I delayed my F1 training. I was just going to do this for a year, right? There was nothing to lose, like taking a gap year. And I was being paid enough that I could cover my bills. So what you start to realise is that actually, as a doctor, once you get into your specialty training, well, you're on a conveyor belt. Now, to step off that, you're losing something. And it comes back to that loss aversion theory. So the more that we can actually use the fact that in clinical practice, you have an opportunity for a portfolio career and try things and work out what are the things you love. And then from there, move forwards. The challenge is that a lot of these decisions require you to give up something in order to try something new. And that risk, when you're an individual single person is one risk to take on. Once you have a family or you've got other people depending on you, it's a whole different story. And so I think that's where actually it comes back to that point about how do we start this earlier? How do we talk to medical students about all the cool stuff they can do in tech? How do we talk to school kids about all the different career paths there are? It's sort of pushing it back because that's whenever people are more willing to take risky decisions.
Can I ask you a little bit about relationship building and relationship maintenance? Because you strike me as someone who'd be really good at this. Are there any things that you do in terms of any methods you have for reaching out or maintaining relationships? Anything like kind of, there's just kind of being a good person and organically meeting people, but then are there any other things that you do?
I always, I think somebody once said it to me and I keep it in my mind. It's like, be interested and interesting. So it goes both ways. But I think, if you're going to take the time to ask someone to give you advice and they're taking the time to give it, you have to listen. the number of times where, people ask, for advice about career paths, and then actually, there's not a really great conversation around it. The more that whenever you're going into that process, you really listen, take on board what they've said. And again, as I said to you before, you then find some way to add value to that person, I think is really, really great. The other thing is, take notes. And I know that sounds a bit crazy, but like before my medical school interviews at Oxford, I had 2 full moleskin notebooks, the really nice ones. I went out and treated myself and was like, right. And my grandfather every week used to cut out any newspaper article related to healthcare and give me a Polly Pocket of these articles every Sunday. So sweet. And I would read them all and make notes in them. And then I would literally learn them. So I went into this interview with like a year's worth of newspaper articles. Now, whether that's the right source that I should have been using is a whole other question. But I did do a lot of reading and I took a lot of notes. And anytime I spoke to someone, I took notes. And I then went back to those notes in a bit like revision, consolidated them. So I have my summary notebook. And I think once you've had a really interesting conversation with someone, it's noting down information about them, stuff that they've told you they find important, and also, what the biggest insights were from that conversation. And keep it really short, headline, 3 bullets, summary. But also try and follow up and add that value. And now we've got all these digital tools, it's so easy to do that. I remember I spent some time in San Diego in a biotech startup, and the CEO there had a digital inventory of everyone she ever talked to. With like name of their dog, their children, their husband, their partner, like everything, and like what they found important. And then when she went and had the follow-up meeting with them, she'd bring it up and she'd know all the information. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know enough people, that's required. But once you get to a point where you've met enough people, like you don't remember all of these personal details about people. But people love feeling connected. So the more you can bring that connection each time you meet them, the better.
I wanted to ask a little bit about your own personal thesis on the future of healthcare. And in particular, I wanted to ask if you have any slightly unusual beliefs or slightly unique beliefs on where things might be going.
So it's not going to surprise you whenever I say that I think technology will change how healthcare is delivered. And when I say that, I mean really disrupt it. I don't think there's one thing that technology can be brilliant at making things more efficient and more effective. But how do we actually completely change how healthcare is delivered and how research is conducted? And I think tech is the way to do that. I do think that we see lots of startups at the minute targeting underserved therapeutic areas. And what I find really interesting about that is, again, to the same point about diversity and ambition, one of the reasons that areas are underserved in healthcare is if you go upstream, the research hasn't actually been done. So there's a really interesting opportunity here, I think, where technology can, you probably have heard of the B2B2C business model, i.e. B to business to consumer. So you have both NHS providers or insurance companies buying it, and then consumers or patients actually taking that home. What I think we'll start to see is a B to C to B. So you'll start by getting a cohort of patients that are really passionate about a condition that's quite underserved, particularly in things like women's health, for example. They will get really engaged with this technology. You'll have patient-reported observations. You might have biomarkers like bloods and tests and things like that. There will be data collected that's never been collected before. And then that data will allow new solutions and new therapeutic approaches for these conditions to be delivered. So you could actually disrupt old school research. Now, the research will have to be done to make sure this is clinically safe, it's actually clinically validated. But technology is a way for us to collect data in new ways that we have never done before and potentially find new clinical correlations that could help us cure diseases that we've never had an approach to. And I think that's the bit that I find really exciting if we can manage to do that.
Are you seeing any examples of this kind of stuff happening at the moment?
Yeah, definitely. If you look at a lot of chronic conditions where you've got patient-focused tools, so patient engagement tools through to patient-reported observations and remote monitoring tools, what you start to see is you're getting like a cohort of patients that are really passionate about this condition. And then they are submitting that data in because they want solutions to be found. There are quite a few examples in the women's health space as well, where you've got sort of engaged cohorts. One of our portfolio companies, actually, UMed, what it does is it integrates with GP records and is creating cohorts of patients with certain conditions where these patients have sort of opted into being part of this cohort, which means anytime there's a clinical trial, whether it's a full-blown clinical trial or an observational research question, you'll know the real-world evidence buzzword at the moment, they can come to that cohort and ask these questions. I think that can go on a whole other step. You look at the work that Genomics England's doing and everything around genomics. If you start to think about if you could have the full data set about patients with a certain condition, a longitudinal data set over their lifetime, what new clinical correlations could we find? And that's quite a different way of doing clinical research than the old school sort of recruitment for a clinical trial and do that trial in isolation.
The last thing I wanted to ask was, have there been any books, podcasts, newsletters, or any other resources that you've been finding useful?
So I read a book quite a few years ago when I was in Forward, it was Building New Power Communities. There's also an HBR article, a short read of it. So if anyone wants to be super efficient, then go for that. But it was brilliant. It uses examples across all different sectors about how do you build communities and groups of people that are really passionate about what you're building and that movement point. And it's all about understanding humans and what's driving them. But it's a brilliant read for anybody trying to build a product or get people on board with something that they're working on. I've also read before, there's a really good online blog called Stratechery. So it's like a combination of strategy and tech. And it's really interesting about looking at the theories around technology and how it's embedded. So it looks at things like aggregation theory. So looking at Uber, Airbnb, and how they've actually, rather than having sort of, if you take Uber, they've got all of the cars. In the olden days, they were just being cab companies that would have had a big fleet of cars. Now what they've done is integrated the user experience with the user. So the transaction of paying for your taxi ride with user booking it. And then what happens is all of the cars come to that interface. So you end up sort of disrupting the supply element of the product. And similarly with Airbnb, the same thing. You used to have hotels, you go directly to the hotel to book. You end up now with platforms like Airbnb that demonstrate all of these different rooms, and all of the rooms and hotels come to Airbnb to advertise there. And it's really interesting to think about that and where it's going to apply to healthcare, because I don't think it really has quite yet. And then I also absolutely love, as I talked about, human psychology and what makes humans tick, because it builds the best teams and the best outcomes. So I don't know if you've heard of The School of Life, but I think it's a brilliant book. And also I'm reading at the minute The Source by Tara Swart. It's all about how do you actually use neuroplasticity to retrain your neural pathways to be more positive and manifest for positive change in your life. So big range there, but I love reading. I've got more books that can fit in a bookshelf, so I should set up a library potentially.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. You can find all my links by going to bigpicturemedicine.co.uk. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, then please consider leaving a review on Apple. By the way, some of these episodes are now available on Spotify and on YouTube in video format. Thanks for listening.